Well, this is Dr. Grande. Today's question is, can I analyze the Department of Justice report on Joe Biden? Just a reminder, I'm not diagnosing anybody in this video, only speculating about what could be happening in a situation like this. If you enjoy this video, please like it, subscribe to my channel, and consider supporting me on Patreon. I'll put the link to Patreon in the description for this video. First, I'll look at the background of this case, move to the summary of the report, then offer my analysis. Joe Biden is the 46th President of the United States. At the time making this video, he is 81 years old. He intends on running for re-election in 2024, but many people have grave concerns about his age and cognitive abilities. Polls indicate that about 76% of American voters believe Joe is too old to effectively serve another term as president. Statistically, Joe Biden's life expectancy is 88 years old. He has about a 66% chance of living to 86 years old, which would be his age at the end of his second term. Here are just some of Joe Biden's unusual behaviors, which have attracted negative attention related to his cognitive functioning. Joe doesn't remember places he's visited and what he did in those places. He struggles remembering people's names, what their jobs are, and their status as living or dead. Joe has trouble finding the right word or completing sentences. He has a pronounced reputation for misspeaking and struggling to make logical connections. He has become increasingly dependent on written reminders. Joe occasionally becomes irritable, frustrated, and angry, and has become downright hostile on the issue of his cognitive abilities. On multiple occasions, he has become confused on stage. When it's time to exit, like after he's finished a speech, he sometimes wanders around aimlessly. Joe occasionally uses archaic and novel expressions like "God save the Queen" and "lying dog-faced pony soldier." He has a reputation for demonstrating inappropriate and creepy behavior when interacting with women and girls, including sniffing, kissing, hugging, and violating personal space. And he has refused to take any type of cognitive test. In November of 2022, Joe Biden's attorneys discovered classified government documents in his former office in Washington, D.C. In December 2022 and January 2023, more documents were found in Joe's house in Wilmington, Delaware. An attorney named Robert Hur was assigned as special counsel to investigate the possible unauthorized removal and retention of classified documents. On February 8, 2024, the Department of Justice released the report by Robert. Now moving to a summary of the report. Joe Biden was interviewed by Robert on October 8 and October 9 of 2023. This was a voluntary interview that took place at the White House. The report referenced recorded conversations between Joe Biden and his ghostwriter that occurred in 2017. Joe Biden read from classified entries to his ghostwriter nearly word for word. The ghostwriter did not have security clearance. During the conversation, Joe acknowledged that he had found classified documents. In addition to the worrisome disclosure of classified information, these conversations demonstrated that Joe struggled to remember events and had trouble reading and conveying his own notebook entries. During the interview with Robert, Joe's memory was even worse than on those recorded conversations with the ghostwriter. Joe could not remember what year his son Beau died, or even supply a range of years. He had difficulty remembering a debate on troop levels in Afghanistan. This was an important debate that would have stood out to him. And Joe could not remember when his term as vice president began or ended. The conclusion of the report was that Joe Biden willfully retained and disclosed classified materials after his vice presidency when he was a private citizen. Despite this, the government decided not to pursue charges against him because Joe had several defenses which could create a reasonable doubt as to his guilt. A few examples: Joe may have thought that he had the right to take classified material because he may have incorrectly confused it with personal property. His memory was significantly limited, therefore this may have been an innocent mistake made without intent to break the law. Joe could have argued that he forgot about the classified documents soon after finding them. A reasonable jury could conclude that he did not retain them willfully. The applicable charge would have been a serious felony that requires a mental state of willfulness. It would be difficult to convict Joe Biden because a jury might view him as a sympathetic, well-meaning, elderly man with a poor memory. Essentially, Joe's memory was so poor and he was so likable that jury members may give him a pass. The evidence did not establish Joe Biden's guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. The report was good news for Joe Biden as far as avoiding criminal charges, yet he was not pleased with the references to his cognitive limitations. Joe Biden defiantly responded to the results of the report, saying that the negative assessment of his mental state was extraneous commentary. He claimed that his memory was fine, despite the overwhelming evidence to the contrary. Joe said, "I know what the blank I'm doing." Joe was particularly upset that the special counsel referred to his failure to remember the date that his son died. He said, "I don't need anyone to remind me of when he passed away." Joe was asked if he took responsibility for being careless with classified material. Instead of taking ownership, he jumped on a proverbial steamroller and flattened his staff by saying, quote, "I take responsibility for not having seen exactly what my staff was doing, things that appeared to be in my garage, things that came out of my home, things that were moved not by me, but by my staff, unquote. Joe was asked why he should be reelected as president. He responded, quote, "I'm the most qualified person in this country to be president of the United States and finish the job I started," unquote. In a blunder characterized by the worst timing imaginable, Joe proceeded to refer to the president of Egypt as the president of Mexico. He also claimed that the special counsel never said he shared classified information, when Robert said that Joe had done exactly this. I guess it should not be surprising that Joe already forgot the contents of the report. Now moving to my analysis. Here are my thoughts on a few areas that stood out to me in this case. Item number 1. The response to the report findings is curious. Instead of focusing on the joy of avoiding criminal charges, Joe became angry that his memory was being questioned. Joe has taken a lot of heat for his memory difficulties recently, and the stress seems to be getting to him. The reason he wasn't charged was largely based on his memory, yet Joe is trying to prove that his memory is good. It may not be the best idea for Joe to deprecate his own defense. If his memory was good, then that makes it seem like he was guilty of the charges. Joe cannot have it both ways. Item number 2. Some people have tried to challenge the integrity of Robert Hur, suggesting that his assessment of Joe Biden was motivated by politics. This may or may not be true, but I find it interesting that the report actually defended Joe quite a bit. For example, Robert talked about how the circumstances surrounding Donald Trump allegedly retaining classified documents are much different than the situation with Joe Biden. Robert minimized Joe's behavior and pointed out how Donald may have acted egregiously. For example, Donald Trump had multiple opportunities to return classified documents and avoid prosecution, but he allegedly chose not to, whereas Joe turned over classified documents and cooperated with the investigation in other ways. Here again, Robert delivers a favorable result for Joe Biden, yet Joe wants to talk about his memory. He's obsessed with focusing on the negative. Item number 3, as I mentioned, those defending Joe Biden have been critical of Robert Hur. They have downplayed the effect that the report will have on the public, saying that it will be forgotten in a matter of days. I find this incredibly hard to believe, although I imagine that Joe Biden will forget it in a matter of minutes. He may have even forgotten the report before he was done defending himself from the accusations contained in it. Joe Biden's allies refused to entertain the idea of Joe giving up on his re-election effort. They explained his poor cognitive performance during the interviews with Robert by saying that the timing was the problem. Joe Biden was preoccupied with the turmoil in the Middle East when those interviews took place. I don't think these allies are doing Joe any favors. They are arguing that when he's under stress, his memory catastrophically fails. That is not an impressive defense. U.S. presidents must be able to function under stress. Another element that I find curious about the criticism of Robert is this assertion that he gave the public more information than required, like his mental health assessment was superfluous. He's not a mental health clinician, so he should have refrained from making an assessment. Joe Biden's allies have asked, why not have a mental health clinician interview Joe Biden because that would settle the matter. I think this is a great suggestion, but as I mentioned, Joe Biden will not submit to a cognitive test. He doesn't like what Robert is saying, but he doesn't want to get someone neutral to make an assessment either. Is he really fighting bias or trying to conceal the truth? On the question of a cognitive test, his allies are once again not doing Joe any favors. They are offering a solution that Joe Biden has refused, and thereby pointing out how this refusal is bizarre and unwarranted. Instead of Joe repeatedly telling people his memory is good, only to forget something important moments later, he should simply take a cognitive test. As far as the appropriateness of Robert making the assessment, he never claimed to be a mental health professional. Robert's discussion of Joe's memory was directly related to the difficulty that the cognitive problems presented in moving forward with the prosecution. Robert had a right to mention what he observed. Otherwise, how would he have supported his decision not to prosecute? Was it possible that Robert was playing politics a little bit? Of course, he probably was to some extent, but that doesn't make his observations incorrect or invalid. He pointed out the same thing that many other people have said on both sides of the aisle. Joe Biden appears to have cognitive functioning difficulties. Item number 4, what do I think happened in this case? This is just a theory, my opinion. President Joe Biden is a likable and relatively honest man, but he simply doesn't have the cognitive abilities to be president. He no longer has the insight to recognize his own failings, so he's never going to declare himself incompetent. His story from now on will always be something like, I know what I'm doing, my memory is fine, and stop asking me to take a cognitive test, even though that request is perfectly reasonable and appropriate. In between making these statements, he will continue to forget important items. This will serve as a constant and sobering reminder of his cognitive limitations. At this point, at least in my opinion, it's clear that Joe Biden should not run for re-election. Some people argue that he should not even finish his current term. I don't know about going that far quite yet, but Joe is certainly testing the patience of the public. Every time he speaks, he only increases the level of concern. Now moving to my final thoughts. What a terrible choice Americans must make as far as selecting the next president. They can pick Joe Biden, who has not committed crimes, but may not remember them if he did, or they can pick Donald Trump, who allegedly has committed crimes, but at least he remembers what he allegedly did. At least 100 million Americans are technically eligible to run for president, yet America will be stuck picking between these two men again. Many people who dislike or distrust one of these candidates feel compelled to vote for the other, like it's the lesser of two evils. But as I've said many times, it's perfectly acceptable to be disgusted by both of them. In a nation with so much resolve, intelligence, ingenuity, productivity, and determination, how can it be that one of these two men is destined to be the leader? Those are my thoughts on the Department of Justice report on Joe Biden. Please put any opinions and thoughts in the comments section. They always generate an interesting dialogue. As always, I hope you found my analysis of this topic to be informative. Thanks for watching.